So welcome, Spring Lake Village. Good to see you again as we continue our series of lectures on contested elections. It is now the first week in November, and as I speak, it is currently Election Day 2020. Now, the election of 1860, some 120 years ago, was perhaps the most consequential election in American history. It's the election that would lead America to war, the American Civil War. And it would forever change the course of American politics, even up until our own time. So let's begin then with our fourth lecture, the election of 1860 on the road to war. By the election of 1860, profound divisions existed among Americans over the future course of their country, and especially over the South's peculiar institution, as it was called, namely slavery. During the presidency of James Polk, the United States had confirmed the annexation of Texas to the Union, had negotiated a treaty with Great Britain for the Oregon Territory up to the 49th parallel, and as a result of the Mexican War, added California and New Mexico as well. The issue of slavery, this very thorny issue, was front and center, of course, already going back to the drafting of the US Constitution in 1787. During the very early years of our American Republic, a number of northern states had already adopted statutes which addressed the emancipation of slaves. So the US Constitution theoretically had given individual slave states in the South the right to determine the future of their so-called peculiar institution. During the 1850s, though, different views about slavery's expansion and its place in America's future fueled suspicion and bitterness between Northerners and Southerners. In Kansas, the question of whether the territory would be open or closed to slavery erupted in violence and political unrest. We examined this in a previous lecture dealing with slavery. Bleeding Kansas, the treatment of fugitive slaves and other issues involving slavery strained and then shattered the nation's two-party system, which had served for a generation to weld sections and interests into two powerful national institutions. So as mentioned, the issue of slavery would persist during the first half of the 19th century as America expanded westward as part of its so-called manifest destiny. We mentioned the annexation of Texas, but of course, the purchase of Louisiana during the administration of Thomas Jefferson would prompt periodic crises over the status of slaveholding in these new territories and in the new states that would be created out of them. There were already rumblings of civil war between the North and South, which would be prompted by the 1820 Missouri Compromise and once again, the 1850 Compromise. And then the very infamous Supreme Court ruling called the Dred Scott decision, which was adjudicated in 1857, voided the 1820 Missouri Compromise by making slavery legal in all U.S. territories. By 1860, the divisions in the country had reached a breaking point. Southerners were outraged over a plot by abolitionist John Brown to start a slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry, Virginia in 1859, an event that garnered headlines in newspapers and magazines across the nation. For example, the November 19th, 1859 issue of Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper led with the story, The Harper's Ferry Insurrection, and an image of John Brown. Northern Republicans obviously were very angered by the Supreme Court's decision regarding Dred Scott, essentially declaring free soil unconstitutional. And Northern Democrats struggled to convince Americans that their policy of popular sovereignty still made sense. So the presidential election of 1860 brought these conflicts to a head with dramatic consequences. Now, on the eve of the presidential election year of 1860, we find the Democratic Party in complete chaos. It was split into three groups along regional lines, each vying for control of the party and each holding different ideas about how to deal with slavery in the West. Now, Democrats had controlled the White House for over 30 years, with the exception of 8. And as I mentioned, they split into factions. There were two primary factions. One would be led by Stephen Douglas of Illinois, the flamboyant senator from Illinois, who was a pro-slavery moderate who had long championed popular sovereignty. He had been the clear favorite of Northern Democrats. Now, Stephen Douglas was a celebrated orator, especially after his historic debates with Lincoln. At this juncture, though, Douglas found himself vilified by Southern Democrats. He tried unsuccessfully to argue that his middle way would enable the nation to pass over the momentary issue of slavery in the territories and thus preserve the nation. But Southern radicals would have none of it when they demanded that their party come out with a platform in clear defense of slavery. So this was the situation when the Democratic Convention met in Charleston, South Carolina on the 23rd of April in 1860. Both Northern and Southern delegates now were ready for a showdown. The traditional rule that a 2/3 majority was required for a candidate to win nomination enabled Southern Democrats to veto the nomination if they voted as a bloc. The first test came when the Southern delegates insisted on a plank favoring a federal slave code for the territories. Douglas, knowing that he would lose every northern state if he agreed, refused to endorse the plank. So when the delegates defeated the plank by a small majority, 50 Southern delegates led by Alabama fire eater William Yancey, just walked out of the convention. So even with these radicals gone, Douglas could not win a 2/3 majority. Neither could anyone else. And after 57 ballots, the convention adjourned without a nominee. Nevertheless, the Democrats held a second convention in Baltimore, Maryland in mid-June of 1860. But the party was badly shattered, and there was now no hope for unity. A raucous floor fight broke out over which delegates from the Charleston Convention should be recognized. When Douglas forces finally established dominance in this matter, the Southern delegates pushed the slave code plank once again. And for a second time, the Douglas forces beat it back and finally managed to nominate Stephen Douglas on a second ballot over John C. Breckinridge, the incumbent vice president. You see him. Here's a picture of Stephen Douglas and John C. Breckinridge, who is the current vice president under James Buchanan. Herschel Johnson, a former governor of Georgia who supported both states' rights and unionism, was named to the second spot on the ticket. So he would serve as Stephen Douglas's running mate. Interestingly, Johnson would later become a Confederate senator. Meanwhile, pissed off Southern Democrats would go on to nominate John Breckinridge of Kentucky to become their candidate for the presidency. I think I spoke out of hand. Is Breckinridge, who, yes, I did mention Breckinridge as the current sitting vice president of the United States. Each of the candidates claimed to be the official Democratic candidate. Now, Douglas's Northern Democratic Party platform excluded any reference to a slave code in the territories and supported the power of federal authority over the territories. It also affirmed its support for a transcontinental railroad to the Pacific and the acquisition of Cuba. Breckinridge's Southern Democrats supported a federal slave code in the territories, the acquisition of Cuba, and the construction of a railroad to the Pacific Ocean. Meanwhile, the Republicans met in Chicago that May and recognized that the Democratic Party's turmoil actually gave them a chance to take the election. But they needed to select a candidate who could carry the North and win a majority of the Electoral College. To do that, the Republicans needed someone who could carry New Jersey, Illinois, Indiana, and the all-important Pennsylvania, four important states that remained uncertain. There were plenty of potential candidates. The most popular candidate was William Seward of New York, who would go down in fame for his purchase of Alaska, sometimes dubbed Seward's Folly. On the first ballot, he actually led the young senator from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. Now, Lincoln was for many kind of an unknown quantity at the time. Now, the first ballot, William Seward would lead Lincoln, who had been defeated in Illinois in 1858 by Douglas. I think I misspoke. Actually, Stephen Douglas had won that senatorial contest in 1858. Seward, however, had a pro-immigrant position that was potentially negative, very negative, especially in states like New Jersey and Pennsylvania. On the third ballot, Lincoln emerged as the best choice. He had become the symbol of the frontier, hard work, and the self-made man and the American dream. His debates with Stephen Douglas during that senatorial contest in 1858 had made him a national figure, and the publication of those debates in early 1860 made him even better known. So after the third ballot, he secured the nomination for the presidency. And Hannibal Hamlin of Maine would be nominated as his vice presidential running mate. Now, complicating the electoral landscape was the emergence of a fourth candidate, one John Bell from Tennessee, who would emerge as the nominee of the newly created Constitutional Union Party, which came together by a combination of former members of the Whig Party and disaffected Southern Democrats. They had a campaign slogan that basically saw that the Union had to be preserved as well as the American Constitution. Their slogan was "The Union as it is and the Constitution as it is." Now, the key to the Republican Party's success was its position on slavery. It opposed the expansion of slavery and had called upon Congress to take measures whenever necessary to prevent its extension. It condemned slavery as an immoral institution, a relic of barbarism. And most Republicans thought that by confining slavery within its present borders and its territorial boundaries, the institution would be placed on the road to eventual extinction. So the Republican Party was a genuine anti-slavery party, but most Republicans rejected a more radical stand that would associate them with abolitionism. So, for example, the party upheld the constitutional sanctity of slavery within the South, and a significant minority, including Lincoln himself, were willing to support a constitutional amendment forever guaranteeing against congressional interference with slavery in the states. Republicans also acknowledged the legitimacy of the fugitive slave clause of the Constitution and accepted its enforcement by proper laws. Republicans therefore separated themselves from abolitionists who were agitating for a quicker, immediate end to slavery, and the adoption of measures such as the emancipation of slaves in the nation's capital, which would render slavery insecure in its present boundaries. And at the same time, moderate Republicans also distinguished themselves from the more egalitarian racial program of abolitionism. Most Republicans accepted the principles of the Declaration of Independence as assuring African American people certain rights now, and perhaps also as ultimate goals to be fully realized sometime in the future. Now, Republicans disavowed measures that would immediately bring about true equality between the races. And in fact, Lincoln, who may have been somewhat more conservative than the core of his party, declared himself against equal rights in voting and office holding at that time. And he even advocated the colonization of African Americans to lands outside the United States, an idea that was altogether anathema to abolitionists. Southerners, however, hardly distinguished between the different anti-slavery and racial views of the Republicans and the abolitionists. So the Republican Party's opposition to the expansion of slavery encompassed a distinctive moral protest against slavery itself, but also contained, at least for many Republicans, a racial concern that territories be reserved primarily for free white people. So here we have once again the four candidates running for president in 1860. Abraham Lincoln, Republican, platform, slavery must not be allowed in the territories. Northern nominee of the Democrat Party, Stephen Douglas, his platform, popular sovereignty should decide the issue of slavery in the territories when they actually become states of the US. John Bell, the nominee or candidate of the Constitutional Union Party, the federal government should support slavery, but also defend the Union. And finally, the Southern Democrat candidate, John Breckinridge, whose platform stated that the federal government must, in fact, protect slavery. So by offering two candidates for president, the Democrats gave the Republicans an enormous advantage. We find Lincoln abandoning for a short time his law practice, and he ran a stay-at-home campaign. I guess you might compare it with sort of the strategy of the current Democratic nominee. And Lincoln made no stump speeches. As he articulated, his primary objective was to hedge against divisions in the Republican ranks. He wanted to take full advantage of the disunity that existed among the Democratic candidates. He encouraged his party loyalists to say nothing on points where it is probable that we shall disagree. All this was in the hopes of creating unity among the Republican Party. We also find John Breckinridge, the candidate of the Southern Democrats, also doing very little campaigning. On the other hand, Stephen Douglas, the candidate pushed forward by the Northern Democrats, was very, very active campaigner, giving many, many speeches on the stump as a supreme defender of the Union, but at the same time, strenuously in opposition of secession. We find most of the contests being fought regionally. Lincoln and Douglas would dominate the North, while Breckinridge and Bell would fight one another for support in the South. Here's a political cartoon showing this regional contest. See Lincoln at the far left. To his right is Stephen Douglas, then Breckinridge, followed by Bell, all fighting it out. Ultimately, though, ripping the country apart because of this very, very deep regional division that existed and would lead ultimately the country to a civil war. So on election day, 4/5 of the eligible voters came out to vote. That was over 81%, remarkable participation. At that juncture, the highest ever for a presidential campaign, presidential election. Now, Lincoln's nomination would prove to be a great windfall for his party. Lincoln would dominate the northern states with the exception of New Jersey, which he split with Stephen Douglas. And he also won the new states of California and Oregon on the Pacific coast. Now, he did capture less than 40% of the popular vote, but he did win 59% of the Electoral College, or 180 electoral votes. Now, while Stephen Douglas won almost 30% of the popular vote, he actually came in fourth in the Electoral College, winning only the 12 electoral votes of the state of Missouri. Breckinridge garnered about 18% of the national vote, but captured 72 electoral votes. Most of his votes came from the South, but also Delaware and Maryland. Bell won almost 13% of the vote, securing 39 electoral votes from the states of Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Altogether, the results in the South are very, very important in our understanding of the deep rifts, sectional rifts that existed. Lincoln would not win any votes in any state that would form the newly established Confederacy, with the exception of the state of Virginia, where he only was able to get 1% of the popular vote, whereas Douglas won a little bit less than 10% of the vote. At the time of Lincoln's inauguration in March of 1861, 7 southern states would secede from the Union, and just a month afterwards, the country would go to war. So here you can see the Electoral College breakdown. You can see how Breckinridge completely dominated the South, also picking up the state of Delaware. Douglas, as I mentioned, came fourth in the electoral count, winning essentially only the state of Missouri and a split in New Jersey. Lincoln, as I mentioned, captured the Pacific Coast states of California and Oregon, and virtually all of the northern states. So Lincoln's election would forever change the course of American history. His election and the perceived threat to the so-called peculiar institution would prove too much for the southern states. South Carolina responded to Lincoln's election first, seceding from the Union on the 20th of December in 1860. This action made front page news in the North 2 days later when Harper's Weekly featured portraits of the state's congressmen on its cover, titled "The Seceding South Carolina Delegation." Other slave states would follow suit shortly thereafter. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, which decided on secession by popular vote. In early February, representatives of those states would gather in Montgomery, Alabama, to found a new nation, the Confederate States of America, which we know today as the Confederacy, and to name its president Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. So Lincoln's election in 1860 showed how politically overwhelmed and vanquished the South was. Slavery would remain the preeminent issue. In pre-war South, as we, during the antebellum South, it was the major issue, but it would later serve as sort of the common frame of reference for unequal power. In addition, religion would shape Confederate nationalism, as Southerners truly believed that the Confederate States of America were actually fulfilling the will of God. The Confederacy even would steer away from the US Constitution by explicitly invoking Christianity in their own constitution. Ultimately, the Confederacy's rationale for secession was inextricably linked to slavery. As quoted, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. So the final results of the election of 1860 did not necessarily make secession inevitable. Read in a certain light, the outcome provided hope for those who sought to maintain the Union and find a resolution to the sectional crisis. Lincoln, while receiving a majority of votes among Northerners, did not receive a majority of all the popular votes. The combined opposition outpolled him by almost 1 million votes. But Lincoln was inaugurated on the 4th of March in 1861, and he gave a speech encouraging the South to return and promising that slavery would be protected where it already existed. But he refused to budge on his support of free soil ideas. So that is an overview of the very critical election of 1860. Once again, I am narrating this fourth in our lecture series on Election Day. It will be very interesting to see how this election plays out, either this evening or over the next several days. So I look forward to seeing you next week when we wrap up our lecture series on contested elections. So take good care of yourself. Look forward to seeing you again.